I'm going to introduce our next panel, New Territory in Philanthropy. And I know there's a number of philanthropists in the audience or aspiring ones. And it's a transforming investment strategy with philanthropy in the world. And it's going to be moderated by Sally Ranney, and she can introduce the other participants.
This panel is New Territory in Philanthropy, Transformational Investment. And transformation is not going from vanilla to chocolate. Transformation is going from vanilla to music. So it's really flipping things around. It's not transactional. It really is changing the progression of what happens after the interaction. So philanthropy now can be it can be a catalyst, an initiator, a leader, an enabler. It can be an idea bank. It can be a partner. There's all different kinds of roles. But right now, because of the lack of leadership we have in this country, it's really more important than ever that philanthropy, business, and state and local governments really come together to have a deep impact on some of the most serious and pressing issues that we have. And I'm going to give you just a little bit of background context of what philanthropy looks like in the United States. So there's 86,000, a little bit over 86,000 foundations in the United States. And they hold $715 billion in assets. And 32% of the 373 billion that was distributed in philanthropy in 2016, let me tell you where it went. 32% went to religion, 15% education, 12% human services, 11% grant-making foundations, 8% health, 3% environment, and then to make up 100%, a lot of different other things. 91% of the households in the United States engage in philanthropy of some sort. They give something. And individuals, 268 billion of that 373 billion came from individuals. 57 billion, or 16% of everything that was given away, was foundations, 9% bequests, and 5% corporations. So it's a really interesting landscape for philanthropy right now, and we've got 3 people here on this panel who have been deeply engaged, but from different perspectives and different sectors. So I think I'll start with Keith. Keith Tuffley is CEO of the B Team. And the B Team has some CEOs from around the world who have come together around climate change, governance, a lot of issues that corporations can contribute to how the world proceeds. One of the things the B Team did, and I can't remember if it was Paris or before Paris, but came together and signed a letter encouraging that, yes, the business community, the corporate community did want to see the Paris Accord proceed. And so, Keith, I want you to tell us a little bit about how the B Team has involved. I know that in one forum on stage, I heard that you raised $1 billion for the oceans. And tell us about that. And then where do you see, from the perspective of business, where is corporate philanthropy going?
Thanks, Sally. Well, to start with the B Team, and I always get the first question always is why the B Team and not the A Team? So I'll get that off first, okay? The reason it's the B Team is because the whole plan A of capitalism of business is just not working particularly well for this century. The plan A of capitalism really is the Milton Friedman Chicago School of Economics theory, where companies, particularly public companies, are there to serve the purposes primarily of their shareholders. And over the years, that's become more and more short-term in thinking. There's been some fundamental mistakes in that theory. Yes, it's produced a lot of wealth, but it's also produced a lot of inequality. It's reduced poverty, but at the expense of inequality. And we're seeing that in China now at the moment. It's dramatically reduced poverty in China, but inequality is increasing enormously. So that's one of the unintended consequences of that theory. That's evolved to a theory around stakeholder value, which obviously is taking into account your employees, your local community, etc., as companies justify their and emerge with their business model. We believe it needs to take another step further, which means that many of the big problems or challenges we face this century aren't in that immediate community or stakeholders where we currently think of companies. And I use an example of the refugee crisis. We have around 65 million displaced people in the world, many of whom are now permanent refugees. They're not sufficiently in the vicinity of companies to say they're part of our stakeholders. So if we use the stakeholder theory of corporate life, it won't solve refugees as a major challenge for the world. Now, climate change, we've now proven the business case on that. The business case of not addressing it is so large, and the business opportunities of addressing climate change are so large that actually we've come leading up to Paris, as Sally said, we were able to mobilise enough companies in the world to put pressure on the negotiators to say, listen, business is behind this now. We're not actually resisting. And we saw that recently with President Trump's amazing announcement and the incredible response from American cities, states and companies. Now, we amongst a whole bunch of others, have helped mobilise them. So we obviously lost the battle to try and keep Trump in the agreement, but I think we've won the war because the response actually from the communities in America has been so tremendous that it's basically saying, let's forget Trump and let's just carry on. And that's what's going to happen. So it just gives an example. We've proven the business case on climate. Unfortunately, we haven't proven the business case on biodiversity. And as Carl highlighted a moment ago, there is a dramatic and huge business case for it, but we haven't proven it. We haven't proven that businesses need to act on plastic pollution through to overfishing, through to acidification, similarly with loss of species. Is there a business case for the loss of wolves or for the reintroduction of wolves? And that's what we now have to prove. We're not going to solve it just with philanthropy. We have to get business involved. And hence, that's the third stage of the business evolution, which is shareholder value through to stakeholder value, now to actually a much broader purpose of business in the world, which is to specifically address some of our big challenges and to create business models out of it so they actually make money, but at the same time solve environmental and social challenges in the world. And that's what Plan B is all about, and using a team of business leaders to help drive it. So our role really is to help philanthropy be at the front line, because often it's philanthropy which is the biggest risk part of the spectrum, and then get business to come in behind to help solve it through smart business models, technology, human resources, the deep supply chains that can be mobilised by businesses, but coming with that business angle to help solve these problems. It's not easy, certainly not, but unless we get business right behind these challenges, our view is that philanthropy will never get there. There's just not enough money that goes into philanthropy, particularly when you highlight 3%. And you don't want 3% going to 20% at the expense of health and education. We want a greater level of philanthropy, but at the same time, we have to have business helping to solve these issues. That's what the thrust of the B team is about. And that's where it gets really exciting for business leaders, because then you can say you're a CEO, your role is no longer just to make money for your shareholders. It's actually to step into the void left by politicians to actually solve some of these big challenges, and that's far more exciting.
Excellent. Well, one of the questions I have is that, do we always need a business case for protecting species?
Yeah.
I mean, that is putting us into a box that we would never get out of. There's something called the rights of nature. And nature does have some unimpeachable rights. And those species are on this planet just as we are. We are not the pinnacle of creation. We think we are, but we're not. And so I just wanted to put that out there. We might have time to have a little bit more discussion about that. You know, there has to be another motivation.
It does. And there's just a quick comment on that because it goes into a deep analysis, but you're absolutely right. But unless we get businesses recognising that if we don't solve this biodiversity crisis and climate crisis, and of course we've overwhelmed the biodiversity crisis by the focus on climate in the last 20 years, which is probably right because it's such an urgent thing, but the biodiversity crisis is now costing in the order of 3% of global GDP, more so than climate change at the moment. So there is a business case for it. Now, you can't then micromanage and say, well, does there have to be a business case for wilderness, for example? And my view is that no, there doesn't. Having said that, there is a very strong business case for protected areas. You know, this whole theory of half Earth or nature needs half, we have to convince businesses that the health of business long term survives on a healthy planet and people living in harmony with the planet and with themselves and our communities. So we have to take a long-term perspective on it.
Right.
But you're right, Stella, we can't argue every time that it's purely we have to prove there's money in this in order to justify that a species should continue, for example.
Exactly, exactly. Thank you very much. Julianne Wrigley, who is a visionary and a pioneer in sustainability, and she is a philanthropist who has been working with ASU, Arizona State University, since about 2004. And over a period since that time, her total contribution is around $50 million, as I understand it. And she helped found the Wrigley Global Institute on Sustainability, which offers degrees in sustainability from an interdisciplinary aspect, and it was the first of its kind at the university level in the United States. So, Julie, please share with us how you went from investment to transformative, because what you did was truly transformative philanthropy. What shifted you to do that, and why sustainability?
Well, Sally, thank you. And Chip, thank you for this incredible conference and bringing together so many great minds. First of all, I don't think I shifted for a variety of reasons. First of all, I was born with this affliction. And so my entire life has understood the need to give back. In fact, I probably learned how to give it away before I learned how to earn it to give it away. At a very young age, I was raised in the coast of Southern California, and at a very young age, I was able to, right in front of us, see the demise of shellfish, for example, abalone. They used to be prolific on our rocks. They were gone, and I wasn't 10 years old. So from an early age, I was probably a young environmentalist. Through my transition, through my educational years, environmentalism, much like we talk about the different political parties, it morphed. It morphed into something that became violent. I was not interested in that. I think we know how and can show how that we can converse and be cooperative. So as a result of watching this, I called myself a conservationist. Even that morphed. I spent years trying to define what I was interested in, both in business and philanthropy. And when I first met the people at Arizona State, I found a place that was willing to do something a little differently. I found a place that didn't want to just focus on how to say no. We can't do things in our future, but rather how to tear down silos in education, how to bring all these voices that might have been working independently together, get social scientists, political scientists, economists, legal experts. Everybody had to start talking about how we were going to work on real world problems. And we're sitting here today because we have lots of real world problems. So I found a home, and the home was ASU. And the reason I take issue with moving from investment to philanthropy is I moved my way of investing. I think there's been a huge movement afoot in philanthropy to move from purely giving away money and not asking or keeping track of it to deep engagement. I work with the team regularly. I still get to live in these nice places. But now with technology, we can do a lot. And I'm not giving up. Whatever I work on, I'm not giving up. So I consider what I do in the various entities I work with as an investment, not a gift. And I think that is growing. And I know in philanthropy, especially with the younger people, they're looking for new ways to be a part of this giving world. They no longer want to just hand over their money. They want to invest in missions. They want to stay included in its work. And Sally brought up something that we haven't yet talked about, so I can either wait or proceed.
Well, why don't you wait?
Okay.
Okay, and we'll go, but the one thing that I would like to add to what you're saying, which is really, really important, is philanthropy is changing. You're absolutely right, and it's changing so much that in 2014, the Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works, the minority party, the Republicans, published something called the Billionaires Club, and it's 92 pages. And it's looking at foundations and organizations that have, they said, quote, have made the agenda and control the agenda of the environmental movement. And they targeted certain foundations, the Ford Foundation, the Moore Foundation, Hewlett-Packard, et cetera, and they also targeted some organizations that have been funded by, by actually members of the Environmental Grant Makers Association, and have, they traced everything through their 990s, and they targeted the Energy Foundation, Climate Works, Greenpeace. There's about 20 organizations that were included in that report. Now, what that tells me is philanthropy is being effective.
Yes. And it tells me they're dealing in fear because we
That's
want
right.
change. And we're not going to stop until we get it.
Yeah.
Everybody in this room can understand.
So our next panelist is Amanda Ellis, and she is a special advisor in the President's Office of the East-West Center, which is headquartered in Hawaii. And she was also, she most recently was the ambassador in New Zealand, and she has worked with the UN very deeply, the UN Security Council and other organizations in the UN. The East-West Center is a remarkable organization. She's had a great deal of influence on the direction that they are going and are going to be going, where they have been. And Chip and I had the opportunity to be there this last year for a philanthropy forum on sustainability that brought philanthropists from the United States and philanthropists from China, really looking at how could they work together, how could they learn from each other. So Amanda, please tell us about some of the work that you've been doing over the years that has involved philanthropy, and then I know that you have your own philanthropy too.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here with such transformative people, and thank you, Chip, for this incredible gathering of brilliant minds. I come at it from another angle. In a previous role, I ran the New Zealand Development Agency, and I worked also at the World Bank as lead specialist for women's economic empowerment before being ambassador to the United Nations. And so I look at it from the perspective of large organizations who sometimes move more slowly than they should. And I have looked at the truly transformative impact that philanthropists have had on these large organizations. And that's really what I wanted to share. It's been amazing looking at the work you have done, Sally, as the co-founder of We Can, looking at the role that Keith played with the philanthropists as part of the B team, who then, of course, moved the dial to have this incredible multiplier impact, for example, with the Paris Accords. And then seeing Julie's work, which I hadn't been familiar with, in academia. And I shared with Julie that I was speaking at a graduate student conference, and I was talking about seeing this incredible integrated model with the Global Institute of Sustainability that Julie founded at ASU. And in the audience, unbeknownst to me, was an engineer from ASU. And he came up afterwards and he said, you know, it's been truly transformative for me. Before I started my degree, I really didn't know anything about sustainability. And now, because it's true, there is this integrated approach, I am going to take my engineering practice forward in a completely different way. So I take my hat off to the three amazing people sitting here who have all been such catalysts for what I like to call a multiplier effect for positive change. Now, a quick story about renewable energy in the Pacific Islands. On my board was the largest philanthropist in Australia and New Zealand, Stephen Tyndall, when I was running the development agency. And he said to me, Amanda, you're spending $250 million every year as your regular budget. Imagine what you could do if you used philanthropy as the venture capital for positive social change and tried a few brave experiments. Big organizations usually are very careful with taxpayer dollars or board member, as in the case of the World Bank, board member dollars, and so we're usually fast followers rather than innovators. And he said, you should be spending at least $200 million on renewable energy in the Pacific Islands. They're the most likely to be impacted by climate change. And diesel is 56 cents a kilowatt hour in the Pacific with transport costs, compared to wind, solar, between 9 and 11 cents. We can really make a difference here. And I'm going to put my money where my mouth is, invest, and then I'm going to show you how we bring together collaborative coalitions for change. And Chip, that's why I'm so excited about this incredible group that you have gathered here together, because that's where you get the multiplier effect. So short story, long story short, we ended up with a $637 million investment over 3 years. That's just been renewed with another $1 billion investment. And we brought together this philanthropic, catalytic knowledge of how to engage in these new technologies in the Pacific Islands. Then we brought in governments and designed energy roadmaps through the government so that they were designing their own futures. But they were futures where the regulatory environment was transparent for the private sector. Then the investment was made through a whole coalition of partners in the infrastructure upfront, and then the private sector was able to come in with local communities, combination of off-grid and network switching, improving the grids, etc. And so here we are 3 years later with a truly transformative impact. So from my perspective, you guys, this whole philanthropic effort is really about how you can be on the forefront of venture capital for positive social change. So thank you.
Well, you have been really instrumental in so many different venues. And when you work at the level that you have, and you've been an ambassador to the UN, and you've worked with a lot of those agencies and other ambassadors, and you have that network, that is an amazing place for both education and philanthropy, and really bringing affinity groups together, not just for the Pacific, but every place.
And in fact, Sally, it's so exciting because just last week, the Senior Vice President for the Sustainable Development Goals, who is very passionate about this effort, called me in and said, can you help us reach out to broader networks? And I've been very lucky because I've had these disparate career experiences where now I can see the power of bringing all these incredible groups together to really try and move the dial on these big problems that we're facing. And I think there are some very willing partners out there that would like to be connected with the brain power and the will in rooms like this.
Well, and also, this has been a very solutions-oriented conference as well, and that's where we need to go. That's where we need to go. I want to go back to Julie, and you proceed with what you were going to say.
Well, I think that while philanthropists and philanthropy is not necessarily perceived as an innovator, I think what's happening is they're recognizing, we all are recognizing our roles today, much as Amanda discussed. We can be innovators. What I'm seeing happen to begin with is that we're no longer interested in Wall Street managing our money. They have done a poor job. No offense. No offense to those of you who are in that background or come from it, but rather we're looking for opportunities to invest more directly in the types of things we believe in. Many people commented because I asked the panel the first day, why would I invest with you and why now? And the reality is we don't see a willingness to be transformative without all the dollars taken out in the middle to reach an end goal. So I think what Sally and I discussed earlier, and I think it's really you're going to see a lot more of it, will be philanthropists understanding they get to take these assets and not only believe in the mission, but also invest directly. And I'm hoping you're going to see a lot more of that. You know, philanthropists, and Sally started the list, we can be innovators, we can be collaborators, we can be catalysts, we can be creators. And I think there's a lot of push towards that.
Well, and that brings up something about the transfer of philanthropic dollars, that wealth, to the next generation. That depending on what study that you look at, in the next 10 years, there's going to be $1.5 trillion in potential philanthropy funds that are going to shift to the younger generation, and the younger generation is not using the same advisors. They don't want to because they have different priorities, but at the same time, it's grandparents and parents or even great-grandparents that started this, and there is a calling, if you will, to preserve the legacy and what the grandparents, what they initially started out, if it was education or health or whatever, but also to have the flexibility to move into new arenas. So it's not an easy thing going from one generation to the next generation. And it's interesting to see how different families pursue the transfer of their wealth through their foundations. And I don't want to take any more time from our panelists, but there is, I'll just say, it's becoming very sophisticated, very thoughtful. It's not just, you know, mom and dad die and we get the money. It doesn't work that way anymore. It's very thoughtful. And the younger generation and their priorities are being listened to by the older generation and vice versa. So it's also difficult because there can be really deep family disagreements. I'd like to ask you, Keith, about you raised $1 billion for oceans, as I've been told. Is this the truth?
Well, I'm not nodding because I certainly don't want to take credit for raising directly $1 billion. But the circumstances were as follows. We had I was invited to attend and participate in a panel in Washington at the Our Ocean event that the Secretary of State Kerry has shown extraordinary leadership on, and that was held last November. And yes, it was a group of fantastic philanthropists, including Rob Walton, and Anissa Costa from Tiffany, and Julie Packard. And it was all about, one, we do have an ocean crisis. I mean, it is an absolute crisis, as Carl highlighted. I mean, this is urgent. And if we don't address this in the next 5 or 10 years, we will be in serious strife about the state of our ocean and then the state of humans. And I think more and more philanthropists and more businesses are recognising it. And so, yeah, the circumstances were that there's an increasing amount of philanthropic dollars going into the oceans, covering all the issues that Carl highlighted. And it was very exciting to be on stage with, obviously, with Secretary of State Kerry and being the innocent party merely moderating this panel, and in the spate of 15-20 minutes of $1 billion being raised for the oceans in that circumstance. I was just the lucky recipient, I should point out. I took all the glory, of course, but it was very, very inspiring to see that acknowledgement and the recognition and the mobilisation. I would like to sort of pick up just one point, if I can, Sally, on a couple of themes that my great colleagues have highlighted. One is that philanthropy is very innovative, isn't it? I mean, there are more and more incredible innovations occurring in philanthropy. And I use this one example, and there's many examples here. I'll just use one. And this is also a model about how wealthy people hand over their assets. Is IKEA Foundation is the majority owner, maybe the sole owner of IKEA. Right, so every time you buy your IKEA furniture, think about it's going to philanthropy, or at least the profit is going to philanthropy. Okay, that's one way in which wealthy individuals can actually hand over their company, which actually make a foundation, and actually the whole ownership of the company becomes a philanthropy. All the profits end up, it becomes a social business. And IKEA is that now. It's the second largest foundation in the world. And that's IKEA Foundation. It's an extraordinary model. And that's point one. Point two is the way they thought about how can they help the climate movement. Now, it wasn't just putting money into individual foundations. It was actually saying we need to get more of these foundations to work together. And they were the instigation behind what we call We Mean Business, which is a group of business NGOs that said we need to coordinate far better our communications, our outreach to companies, and our mobilisation efforts. And it brought together 7 large NGOs. We at the B team were one of those. And that helped us to mobilise coordination leading up to the Paris Agreement. And so they've just recommitted $48 million the next 3 years to We Mean Business, amongst other groups as well. But it just shows, again, the innovation shown by philanthropy. It's actually saying we need to get more coordination. We need to create a movement. It's not just to sort of put dollars, sunk dollars. It's actually how do you really get leverage out of these dollars? Exactly. And so that shows a real innovation in the way that philanthropy is being mobilised. And so I think it's very, very exciting times for how philanthropy and business are working together. Yeah. We're seeing more and more companies recognising they want to work with innovative philanthropists to change their business, to actually look at Unilever, how they actually use their businesses to change consumer behaviour, how they take responsibility for the entire value chain, the entire supply chain, but also how consumers use their products, whether it's longer showers, because therefore it means more energy being used for the shampoo they're using, through to what people do with the plastics from the ice creams. And so it's that coordination and working with expert philanthropists to actually change the business model itself. That's where you get real leverage in the future.
Yeah, and speaking of leverage, affinity groups or aggregated groups of foundations coming together that have the same interests so that they can leverage, they might only be able to put in 100,000 or, 50 million or 2 million or whatever it is, but there are others out there, always there are others out there who will come to the table, and you can really leverage those funds by aggregating them. The other thing that very few foundations do, but they have the legal right to do, is program-related investments. Now, program-related investment means that if there was an innovative company, which there are many here in the room, that needed some financing to go forward, and that everything that company is about matches the purposes and the programming of that foundation can give them a program-related investment, and that's exactly what it is. It's an investment, and that foundation actually has an equity piece then. So foundations can, in their endowment, they can invest, but now they can take that grant money and they can do that. Very few foundations do this, and I'm not sure why, but I think the time is now, because philanthropy can play a really significant role in getting these clean tech and innovative tech and renewable energies out into the market. There's so many that are on the verge of going and just need a little, need a little help. There's also an organization called the Environmental Grant Makers Association, and it started in 1987. I was actually with the foundation then, a family foundation, and was a member, and it has grown to about, I understand, because I'm not a member anymore, 170 foundations, and this is where a lot of the aggregation of environmental interests happens. So I wanted to share that. I'd like to go back to you, Amanda, in your thoughts about philanthropy in China as it relates to philanthropy here in the States, and how can that connect in a more substantial, tangible way for common purposes and interests like oceans and renewable energy?
Thank you, Sally. That's a great question. And just to give a little bit of history, the East-West Center seeded an idea several years ago of an organization called the China Global Philanthropy Institute. And Bill Gates and Ray Dalio were the two investors on the American side, and there were three investors on the Chinese side: Nguyen Sheng, who was from Inner Mongolia, Madame He Changyu, and the third name I'm embarrassed to say I cannot pronounce. So the five of them committed $10 million each over 5 years to really see how Chinese and American philanthropists could work together. And the impetus for this was Bill Gates' early visit to China, where he tried to get sign-up to the Giving Pledge, and many of you will remember that was not particularly successful. So this was another model which started to try to take things from a different angle. And each year at the East-West Center, there's been a gathering of Chinese and American philanthropists. And this last year, just prior to the big IUCN 4-yearly conference, which was held in the United States for the first time ever in Hawaii, brought together philanthropists such as Julie and Sally and experts like Keith to come together and really have some deep conversations. Now, what was interesting is that the Chinese are on a very steep learning curve, but as we know, they're also very fast learners. And the largest single endowment in China is actually only $500 million, which is tiny when you compare it to something like $75 billion with the Gates Foundation, which would be the 4th largest development agency in the world were it a government program. And what has been interesting is that the Chinese have said, well, we see philanthropy very much as a family endeavor. So this goes back to Sally's earlier point, is how is money passed on, and how do you imbue the next generation with a sense of philanthropic mission? So I think what's interesting now is that there's a lot of potential for partnership, and we're really learning how is it that we come together in meaningful ways to be able to work together. And I think Keith has just been in China, so would probably be a good person to follow up on this. And Julie also was at the event. So I did also want to say just a quick word. My colleague Ami Dalal, wave Ami, is here from Finca. And Finca is an interesting organization that was a transformative approach to finance. around the same time as Grameen Bank with Mohammed Yunus, really just saying, well, we can give small amounts of capital, but it's now second generation, and the founders of Finca, who all have philanthropic interests, are now getting their children involved in the same way. So I think that that's very interesting, seeing how an innovation can occur, become mainstream. There's 2 million clients of Finca, and then start looking at how do you do solar, which Ami will be talking about at the bottom of the pyramid, and then how do you get the next generation involved so that they meaningfully pledge. Last comment, there were young second-generation philanthropists with us at IUCN last year, and you'll remember that they actually got up and collectively made a pledge of $1 billion on the spot as next-gen philanthropists. They didn't know what to, though. So there's clearly a lot of money in China that this group needs to harness. Sorry to be so long.
Yes.
Yes. However, having had the privilege of participating in one of these East-West conferences, the key is right now, the Chinese want to learn from how we're doing it, but they're not interested at this point in investing in something that might go on in the United States. They see the need in their own country. They want to learn our ideas. I think the opportunities are in these world problems, oceans being a wonderful example. But at this point, they were interested in the Nature Conservancy model and some of those to take home. So that's a caveat to that. On a much lower bottom of the pyramid level in terms of how we educate and how we help people learn about giving back. Probably 12, 14 years ago, Arizona State started a program called Women in Philanthropy. And everyone gave $1,000. Its mission was to help people women learn about philanthropy, learn to network, and learn how to give back with something larger than themselves. And everyone gave $1,000, and when they grew to, say, 500 members, they had $500,000 a year to give away to these programs at Arizona State. They learned how to study it. They could bring to the table their interests. And it's a remarkable opportunity when you think you can only give $1,000 and you magnify that and you magnify the learning process. It's been a wonderful catalyst in that community and in the state.
And I think
Julie's model has been copied in China. Over the last
fabulous.
couple of years.
Yes. Did you hear that? Julie's model has been copied in China. So Keith just came back from China, and I don't know if you want to comment about that or...
Yeah, no, I'll just make a couple of quick comments. I've just spent 2 weeks there. Went to Shanghai, Beijing, Guiyang, and Changsha. Can I just get a sense, how many people here have been to China? That's fantastic. I don't know whether you've been there recently or a long time ago. I hope you're as blown away as I was about what's happening there, both scary and exciting. I don't know which one I'm feeling either way on both ways, but it is frightening if they continue the form of development that's been occurring in the last 25 years in a trajectory going forward. I really do hope they keep all the philanthropy in China, if that's the case, because if they don't get the next 30 years of development right, we're all in trouble. Because the extraction, it's not a local issue, it's a global issue, both in terms of emissions, but also in terms of the impact that China will have in terms of biodiversity, not just in China, but more broadly. But incredibly exciting about some of the discussion going there. I went to a conference called the Eco Forum Global just last weekend, and the way in which many of them are thinking about this next form of development, they recognise that if the average Chinese end up with the average ecological footprint that the average Australian or the average American has, we actually do need 3 or 4 planets, and we don't have it. Quite clearly we don't have it, despite the fact that I think NASA just discovered another 200 planets somewhere out there. So it is, there's some very advanced thinking about what they call eco-civilization and how does China develop now in a way that really does allow people to live in harmony with the planet with ultimately zero ecological footprint. and that linking into their One Belt, One Road project or plan, which is obviously much more regional development. So it's very exciting what's occurring there, and but the more support that I think, and there's learnings clearly both ways. They're spending twice as much each year on clean energy than America does on pure dollar terms, and that's actually the disparity is actually increasing. So it's very, very exciting what's occurring there. And what's interesting is on philanthropy is, there's no 100-year-old money like with the Rockefellers, etc. This is one generation. This is the people who have earned the money in the last 30 years. It's them and their children who are now looking to develop the philanthropic model going forward. So again, I think there's a great opportunity for two-way learning to be occurring here.
Well, thank you very much, and we are almost out of time, but there's one other thing that I want to do. As you know, the American Renewable Energy Institute gives out several awards every year, and we're going to be giving them out over the course of the next day and a half. And the first one goes to Julie.
Fantastic. Oh, I didn't see you.
Oh my God. I'm not sure we can move this.
She took a huge leap with a lot of her money to get us down the road as far as we are on really educating people and getting degrees in sustainability. She was the first one. Woo. Sustainability pioneer.
Oh my God. Wow. I only have one comment. It took a team. I just got lucky enough to find the right team. But they do all the work and I get the benefit. Thank you. Sally, this is remarkable.
It's from all of us at AREI.
Oh my heavens. I'm speechless. It happens rarely. Thank you all.